All right, well, welcome back, and so we're just going to continue now to talk about child labor. Child labor is quite widespread. It's a clear problem in the developing world. There's some data on it in the textbook. And in some cases, it's helpful to analyze this in a traditional supply and demand framework. And there may be a single equilibrium. That equilibrium may include child labor, and it may not. And that would cause us to think about one set of policy approaches. There may be other cases in which child labor is well modeled as a multiple equilibrium problem. And when it's a multiple equilibria approach, there's a specific, different way to think about what policy could do, how policy could work. With the multiple equilibria conditions, a ban on child labor, we expect, would improve family welfare. If there's not multiple equilibria in the short term, a ban could harm family welfare because income for the family falls and nutrition for the child falls. So we have to have different strategies to address the problem. So that's the essential idea. Banning child labor, that's certainly a goal. If we want it to be effective, we have to combine it with some other policies in many cases. So I will, at this point, turn attention to think about a model that we will use of labor markets in which there's child labor. And in this regard, we can build up our model with a set of assumptions. And we think they're reasonable assumptions. One of them is called the luxury axiom, right? And so the luxury axiom is essentially saying that parents are good. I would like to think that nearly all parents are good. So the notion of the luxury axiom, it's kind of analogous to a luxury good that you purchase as your income is higher. The luxury axiom says that no parent sends their child out to work unless the family has to, out of financial necessity. So the model that we will develop makes this assumption. If this assumption is wrong, we need to think about a different kind of model. Right? The other is called the substitution axiom. Right? And so the substitution axiom, in very simple terms, says that everything that a child can do, an adult can also do. And so it challenges the idea that we have child labor because children have nimble fingers for producing rugs. If that's the case, well, the substitution axiom doesn't hold. But there's lots of studies from lots of countries and plenty of industries, including the rug industry, that shows that it's just a myth that children, because of small hands or whatever, can produce rugs differently. And in fact, uniformly we find that adult labor is more productive than child labor. That's not very surprising, right? So a way of just capturing this substitution axiom has to do with comparing the quantity that an adult could produce in one day, say, of rugs or whatever the good is, in comparison to the quantity that the child could produce, right? And the first point is that this quantity is larger, and so there's some kind of question that we might have about how much larger that it would be. But so the notion here can be that the quantity of output that the child can produce is equal to some fraction. The textbook uses gamma as that fraction. Some fraction of adult labor outcomes, right? So for example, gamma might be 0.5. That means children in a day of work produce half as much as an adult does. So we multiply the adult quantity of output for the day times 0.5. That tells you the quantity the child produces. So the substitution here says that children and adults can produce the same product. However, it's not reasonable with the data that we have to say that they produce the same amount. It's the same product. All right. So let's see where this kind of analysis can get us. If we make these assumptions, then in that case, what can we learn about the economics of this? So we're going to see that writing down the different amounts that adults and children can produce enables us to do something which is to consider adult and child labor in the same modeling framework. In general, as I've said, if we can put things in two dimensions, we can see the principles much more clearly, right? So in general, as in labor market analyses, we have some kind of labor. It's going to include some combination of child and adult labor in an exact sense that I will tell you on the x-axis. And we have some wage of some kind here on the y-axis. So the first thing that we will look at is the quantity of adult labor. So we're going to make things simple here and assume that all adults work. It's not unreasonable. In developing countries, everybody has to work in some way or another, at home or otherwise. In any case, we'll make the simple assumption that all adults are working, which means that we have a perfectly inelastic supply of adult labor. Call it LA, adult labor among adults, right? And so that's the first thing. Then the second idea has to do with the use of how we're going to apply the luxury axiom in this case. Here we're going to say that there is out there some wage, I'm going to call it WH for a high enough wage, at which no family would ever send their children out to work. This is a green pen. Right? So that tells us that the first part of the labor supply curve is going to be, first of all, vertical, and secondly, reflect the full amount of adult labor. Now we're going to consider child labor. There might be no child labor at all. What I'm going to do is, just for reference sake in some cases, what I'm going to do is to add onto this diagram how much labor that there would be if it happened to be the case that all children were working, right? And so here we're looking at the effective productivity of children in comparison with adults. So when I write here LT for total amount of labor, that does not mean, well, I've drawn it here roughly so that LA is about half as big as LT. So, right, that does not mean that the number of children working is similar to those of adults. This might very well represent twice the amount of work of adults because we have this relationship. We're trying to think about one framework to think about labor, child labor, and adult labor, and so we're interested in what the productivity is in adult labor equivalents. That's what enables us to write this down in terms of a general wage. Okay? I think I'm going to go and grab this red pen. So let's similarly think about the opposite side of the situation in which there's a very low wage. All of this for unskilled labor, by the way. I think that's worth underscoring. This is the unskilled labor market. I mean, perhaps obviously children don't participate in the skilled labor markets, right? So I'm going to here define WL as a wage that is so low that in order for the family to eat, to survive, they conclude, although they really don't want to send their children to work, that they have to send all of their children out to work. So this represents the sort of bottom part of the overall labor supply schedule, combining here child labor and adult labor. The question is what happens in between, and the general notion is that no one wants to send their children to work, but as the wage were lower, at least some families would feel that and discover that they have to send at least one child out to work in order to make ends meet. And as I develop this, keep in mind, when we talk about, as the wage fell or with a lower wage, that's just a way to describe the graph easily. Keep in mind, there's no assumption that the wage is either falling or rising. I'm only describing the labor supply function, what amount of labor that families are willing to supply at any wage. But if the wage were lower, more families would find it necessary to send their children out to work. Maybe you have someone who holds out but now has to send one child out. You have various people and families finally sending their last child out to work. So, as a result, this gives us the rest of the labor supply curve. It's not necessary that there be an S-shaped curve. Everything works the same if this were a straight line, but the sigmoid or S-shaped type curve is something that is often assumed and is consistent with how we think about this. It's not essential. Right, so what we have just found is a labor supply schedule for an economy in which children they may not, but children may work. All adults work, and children may or may not work. Maybe all children work, or maybe some children work. And this is a pretty strange looking supply curve. I will give that fact to you. But it comes from a couple of different sources. The key thing here is the luxury axiom. And what this is giving us is the backward bending supply schedule for labor. That is to say, in general, when we think about an individual, we think that as wage or income rises, labor supply is going to look like this. The amount of labor people are willing to supply will go up with the wage, but eventually the curve typically bends back. And that's the case where you have someone who's made $6 million that year. Are they going to take a week off and go for vacation, or are they going to think, no, that last couple $100,000 is too valuable to me? And so this kind of backward bending supply schedule can be seen also in labor markets in rich countries like the US. There's an analog here. The idea is just that the family is rich enough so that total hours worked by the family go down. It's just that instead of looking at the upper end, our worker who has made many millions of dollars, here we're looking at the very lower end, where even a modest rise in the unskilled wage for adults can lead to the ability of families to take their children out of the labor force. We assume that's what they want to do. Okay, so that's just the supply curve. So let's just talk about equilibria. Well, under some circumstances, there's just one equilibrium. So suppose that demand for labor happens to be high and fairly elastic. Here, we have only a single crossing of the supply with this demand curve. This is an equilibrium with a high wage and one in which only adults are working. So this is one of many reasons why one of the best anti-poverty programs that you can have is a high demand for unskilled labor. But we may not have that. So let's think about a sad case. And in this sad case, we have a very much lower, although still elastic, demand for labor. In that case, there's only a single equilibrium, crossing point between this demand for labor and the total supply schedule for workers, adults, and children. And so this is the equilibrium. And unfortunately, it's associated with a very low wage. And also, unfortunately, it's associated with, in this framework, all of the children working. Now, we know that it could be a problem for these families without any other policies, and we need other policies, to simply ban child labor, because we've assumed the luxury axiom. We've assumed that parents only send children out to work because they absolutely have to. So that reveals that they care about their children, and yet their children go out to work, so that shows that the families would find themselves and view themselves as worse off if nothing else changes by banning child labor. It doesn't mean we don't do everything we can to end child labor. It means the task is a little bit more complicated. Right? So I have one other case to talk to you about, and that's the multiple equilibria case. In this case, we have a demand for labor that is sufficiently inelastic so that it cuts the labor supply curve, really cuts it 3 times. One of those points will turn out to be an unstable equilibrium. Well, here is one example of such a demand curve, right? So here we have one equilibrium. Here we have another equilibrium. This is our unstable equilibrium, our economic divide. So I'm going to call this E for equilibrium. I'll put a check next to it because that's good. And here we have our WE, our equilibrium, X for bad outcome, right? So this is an equilibrium for the same kind of reasons that you find an equilibrium comparing a labor supply curve with a labor demand curve. If the wage is higher than the equilibrium, there's pressure down on the wage. Similarly, if the wage is lower than the equilibrium, there's pressure up. So what does that look like over here? Well, suppose we start out with a very high wage. That's not an equilibrium because while all adults want to work with this high wage, in fact, the demand is not high enough. Only a smaller number can work. And so every adult wanting to work, they'll offer a lower wage, and that'll put pressure down on the wage. Exactly. The analogous situation happens when you're near this equilibrium. There'll be upward pressure on